Every partner's worst fear quietly becomes my reality the night my husband cancels again, and I realize I expected the disappointment. I sat in the car with the engine off, the dashboard clock glowing a few minutes past 7. I'd parked where he could see me pull in, just in case he arrived late, and looked around first. I told myself he would show. I told myself not to assume anything. Still, I checked my phone more than once, even though it hadn't buzzed. I smoothed the sleeves of my sweater and glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I'd dressed carefully, the way I used to when dinners like this still felt important. The restaurant doors opened and closed as couples walked inside together, laughing, touching each other's arms, moving with a kind of ease I remembered but didn't feel anymore. I knew even then, and that realization sat heavy in my chest. My phone lit up in my lap. I didn't open the message right away. I stared at the screen, already aware of what it would say, already rehearsing how I'd respond so I wouldn't sound upset. When I finally read it, my shoulders dropped. Another apology, another explanation about work running late, another promise to make it up to me soon. The words were familiar enough to feel almost rehearsed, even if he hadn't meant them that way. I typed back something simple. Okay, drive safe. I didn't add anything else. I didn't ask questions. I didn't say how long I'd been waiting. That part of me had learned when to stay quiet. I stayed parked longer than I needed to. Through the windshield, I watched people disappear into the restaurant, watched the doors close behind them. No one looked rushed. No one looked unsure. They all seemed certain they were exactly where they were supposed to be. What surprised me wasn't the disappointment. It was the absence of shock. I didn't feel angry or blindsided. I felt tired, like my body had already prepared for this outcome before my mind caught up. That's when it hit me. I'd adjusted my expectations a long time ago. I just hadn't admitted it. I started the car and pulled out of the lot without ever stepping inside. The drive home felt longer than usual. My phone stayed face down on the passenger seat. I didn't want to see it light up again. As I stopped at a red light, I asked myself a question I hadn't wanted to answer before. When did patience turn into something else? I turned onto my street, knowing this wasn't just about a canceled dinner. It was about how familiar the letdown had become, and what that said about the life I was quietly accepting. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. If you already expect to be disappointed, is it still love, or is it just habit? I start replaying years of canceled plans and realize his absence was never sudden, it was gradual and normalized. The next morning, I drove to work in silence. No radio, no podcast, just the sound of the road and my own thoughts, louder than I wanted them to be. As I sat in traffic, moments from the past began lining up in my head without me inviting them. Birthdays shortened because he was on call. Trips postponed because the timing wasn't right. Conversations that started with, "We'll talk later," and never came back around. None of it had felt alarming at the time. Each moment made sense on its own. Work was demanding. He was tired. Life was busy. But strung together, they formed a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully I'd been filling in the gaps for him. Making excuses, explaining his absence to friends, telling myself this was what commitment looked like. Later that afternoon, standing in the grocery store aisle, I caught myself picking up things he liked without thinking. His favorite snacks, the brand of coffee he preferred, habits built from years of anticipating his needs. And suddenly, I wondered when he'd last done the same for me. Daniel was good at framing his absence as responsibility, providing, sacrifice. Those words had carried weight for a long time. I'd admired him for it, defended him with it. He works so hard, I'd say. He does it for us. But as I stood there holding a basket of groceries, I realized something uncomfortable. Responsibility had become a shield, one that protected him from ever having to explain why he wasn't emotionally present. And I'd helped hold it up. That night, I lay in bed beside him while he slept. The room was quiet, the light from the street slipping through the curtains. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I hadn't let surface before. When did endurance become my contribution to the marriage? Somewhere along the way, being understanding had turned into being silent. Being supportive had turned into being flexible to the point of erasing myself. I told myself this was what mature relationships required. That love wasn't about constant attention. That I was strong for not needing more. But lying there, I felt the weight of how much I'd stopped asking for. A few days later, I met Nina for coffee. She asked how I was doing, and for once, I didn't give the polished answer. I told her I felt lonely. I told her I felt like I'd been waiting for my own life to start again. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her mug. Then she asked me something simple that caught me off guard. "Do you feel emotionally partnered?" she said. "Or emotionally alone?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was sitting right there between us, heavy and undeniable. Alone. Nina didn't tell me what to do. She didn't tell me to leave or confront him. She just said something I couldn't shake. "Understanding doesn't mean disappearing," she said. "And love doesn't require you to keep shrinking." On the drive home, her words replayed in my head. I thought about how often I'd chosen peace over honesty, how many times I'd stayed quiet to avoid tension. And that's when another realization landed. I had been defending Daniel's absence more than he ever had. I was the one smoothing things over, making excuses, lowering expectations, carrying the emotional weight so he wouldn't have to. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I felt different. Not angry, not ready to act, just clearer. And clarity has a way of making the next step unavoidable. Before I tell you what finally pushed me past that point, let me ask you, how do you know when being patient crosses the line into losing yourself? The night I let someone sit with me in my sadness, I finally understood how unseen I'd been. It was late when Evan stopped by. Nothing important. He was returning a book Daniel had lent him weeks earlier. I almost didn't answer the door. I was still wearing the same clothes I'd had on all evening, curled inward, trying to convince myself I was fine. When I opened it, he paused for a second. Not long, just enough to notice. "Are you okay?" he asked, gently, like he wasn't expecting an honest answer. I shrugged and stepped aside. I didn't invite him in with words. I just moved out of the way. We sat on the couch with space between us. I expected him to hand me the book and leave. That's what people usually do when they sense something heavy they don't want to intrude. But Evan stayed. He didn't ask questions right away. He didn't fill the quiet. He just sat there, hands folded, waiting. That patience cracked something open. I started talking without planning to. About the canceled dinner. About how tired I felt. About how lonely it was to keep making excuses for someone who wasn't there. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't tell me what I should do. He listened. And that was the moment I realized something that made my chest ache. This was the first time in years I felt fully heard. The words came out slowly at first, then faster. I admitted how often I went to bed alone. How often I stopped sharing my thoughts because it felt easier than waiting for the right moment that never came. How being married didn't protect you from feeling invisible. Evan didn't flinch. He didn't look uncomfortable. He just nodded, like he understood more than I expected him to. That understanding felt like relief and danger at the same time. Nothing physical happened. Not even close. But the comfort settled in my body in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Warm. Steady. Human. And that scared me. After he left, the house felt louder than before. I sat alone on the couch, replaying the conversation, searching for a line I'd crossed. I couldn't find one. And yet, guilt crept in anyway. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because of how easy it had been to let someone else be there. How natural it felt to speak freely. How little effort it took to feel seen. That realization hurt more than the loneliness had, because it meant I'd been living without something essential for a long time. I went to bed that night knowing something had shifted, not between Evan and me, between the life I was living and the one I'd been pretending was enough. The boundary I expected to be tested never was. Instead, I was left with a harder truth to face. If a single conversation could make me feel this understood, what did that say about my marriage? And what did it mean that I'd been surviving without that feeling for so long? Before I tell you what happened when I finally brought this back home, let me ask you, if comfort alone can feel this powerful, where do you draw the line? When I finally explained how lonely I'd been, my husband treated it like an inconvenience instead of the warning I meant it to be. I waited until the kitchen was quiet. The dishes were done. The lights were low. Daniel was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone like it was any other evening. I watched him for a moment, noticing how relaxed he looked, how unaware he seemed of the weight sitting in my chest. "I need to talk to you," I said. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. That should have told me something right away. I told him I felt alone, that I felt like I'd been waiting for him for years, not just for dinners or plans, but for presence. I tried to keep my voice steady, to speak from how it felt instead of listing every moment that led me here. At first, I felt hopeful, because he was listening. Then he sighed, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to signal impatience. I don't understand why this is such a big issue, he said. I work hard. I do everything I can for us. The words landed flat. I told him I knew he worked hard, that I appreciated what he provided, but that providing wasn't the same as being there. He shook his head slightly, like he was trying to stay calm. Everyone's busy, he said. This is just how life is sometimes. I felt something tighten in my chest. Because he wasn't hearing me. He was categorizing my pain as inconvenience. Daniel started explaining his schedule, his responsibilities, the pressure he was under. He talked about how everything he did was for our future, for security, for stability. I'm doing this for us, he said. That's love. I stood there listening, realizing he truly believed that. To him, love was consistency. Bills paid, a roof over our heads, showing up in the ways that were measurable. I asked him when we'd last talked without distraction, when we'd last sat together without one of us looking at a screen or a clock. He paused, then shrugged. I don't think it's that serious, he said. You're overthinking this. That was when frustration finally surfaced. I told him it wasn't about one canceled dinner or one late night. It was about years of feeling like I came second to everything else. About learning not to expect too much so I wouldn't feel disappointed. He looked genuinely confused. I've never cheated on you, he said. I've never done anything wrong. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because I realized we weren't arguing about facts. We were arguing about meaning. I asked him if neglect counted as betrayal. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, I don't see it that way. There was no yelling, no raised voices, just calm. And somehow, that calm hurt more than anger would have. Because it meant he didn't see my loneliness as damage. Just discomfort. Something to manage. Something to push through. I felt the hope drain out of me, replaced by a deep, quiet devastation. Not because he didn't love me, but because he loved me in a way that left no room for what I needed. That realization settled heavily between us. I stopped talking. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I finally understood something I hadn't wanted to before. We were speaking the same language, but we meant entirely different things by the word love. And if that gap stayed unaddressed, I didn't know what it would cost me next. As I stood there in the kitchen, I realized the real question wasn't whether he'd hurt me. It was whether I was willing to keep living like this now that I could finally name it. That's when I understood the truth. Accepting comfort didn't break my marriage. Ignoring myself almost did. I slept in the guest bedroom that night. Not because we fought. Not to make a point. I just needed space to hear myself think. The room felt unfamiliar, but calm. When morning light slipped through the curtains, I realized how long it had been since I'd woken up without bracing myself for disappointment. I stopped replaying the conversation in my head. I stopped arguing facts that would never land the same way for both of us. Instead, I asked myself a quieter question. What do I actually need? When Daniel and I talked again, it wasn't a confrontation. I didn't accuse. I didn't list examples. I didn't ask him to agree with me. I told him I needed presence, attention, emotional availability. I told him that being patient had cost me more than I'd admitted, and I wasn't willing to keep paying that price. There were no threats, no deadlines, just clarity. I wasn't asking him to change overnight. I was telling him what I would no longer accept. And for the first time, I didn't soften it to make it easier to hear. Something shifted after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but I felt it. I stopped shrinking to keep the peace. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fix. I trusted the part of me that had been speaking quietly for years. That part had been right. The marriage didn't end, but it didn't stay the same either. It moved into something more honest, whether that honesty would hold or not. I didn't know where we were headed, but I knew who I was again. There was no clean resolution, no perfect outcome, just awareness, the kind you can't put back once you have it. I understood that comfort wasn't the problem. Silence was, And pretending I didn't need more had almost erased me. That was the real cost. And I wasn't willing to pay it anymore. I don't know how this marriage ends, but I know I won't disappear inside it again. Some betrayals aren't loud. Some boundaries aren't obvious. And some relationships survive absence longer than they should. If this story made you uncomfortable, you're not alone. This is just one truth. There are more like it on True Lies Diaries, stories about emotional neglect, blurred lines, and the quiet choices that change everything. How much absence do you think love can survive?